What's going on, young people? Thanks for joining me for our first homework video of our last unit, social psychology. Not a particularly huge unit, but we already have 6 homework videos from this particular unit. So today we're talking about attribution and person perception. So that's like the first standard for unit 9 on social psychology. We're gonna have 5 Roman numerals, 5 sections of notes that we're gonna talk about. And hopefully you were able to join me for class when we talked about sort of our introduction for social psychology, okay? So all this stuff you should already have down in your notes from class. If you weren't there, if you didn't get this down, you probably need to go pull up those notes to get it down. But social psychology is about social interactions, how we are influenced by others. And today we're talking about how we try and explain other people's behaviors. Our brains are a little bit lazy. We call this being a cognitive miser. Our brains don't like to work very hard, so we often try and come up with simple explanations for why people do what they do, okay? And so we can attribute people's behaviors either to their situation or their disposition, meaning it's out of their control, it's based on their environment, their external circumstances, or it's within their control, it's because of who they are. That's why they did what they did. We can also attribute people's actions as either being stable, it's the kind of thing that's going to happen again and again and again, or as being unstable. The way they acted today might not be the way they act in the future. So all this was from our notes in class. I want to talk about a few things that impact how we attribute, how we explain people's behaviors. So as we mentioned a couple of units back, the society, the culture you grow up in impacts the way you explain people's behaviors. If you grow up in a Western culture, it's more individualistic. You're more likely to blame the person, give the individual some agency, some credit or blame for what they're doing. Whereas in collectivist cultures, they are way more likely to take a holistic analytic approach, a bigger approach, and think about how the situation might be impacting the person, okay? Now, this plays out in the way that we explain people's behavior, something called the halo effect, where if we like one thing about a person, if they're physically attractive, in the United States, if they are tall, we assume a lot of other things about them. It's like if you know one good thing about somebody, you assume that everything else about them is pretty good. Even if that thing is a dumb thing, like their physical appearance or the sports team they like, or where they grew up or the school they went to, right? Like you learn one good thing about someone, you assume lots of other good things are true about them, and they have a good intent when they are acting. Part of this comes from what's called the actor-observer effect. Okay, so actor observer, there's always 2 parties, 2 individuals, 2 people, right? The actor is the person doing the thing. They typically understand all the different factors and context and environmental impacts for why they do what they do. In contrast, the observer, the person who's just watching, we might not know about that person's life or what's going on with them. So instead, the observer typically emphasizes the disposition. This is because like we are ignorant about what's really going on deep down. Okay. So when you see someone do something, when you try and explain their behaviors, typically we make false assumptions about them. FA, false assumptions, which brings us to the FAE. Sometimes I call it the false assumption error. Technically, it's called the fundamental attribution error. It's fundamental, we all do it. It's about how we explain people's behaviors, and it's a mistake that we just constantly make again and again and again. And here's the FAE, here's the mistake that we make. We explain other people's behavior as being stable and dispositional. Specifically, when they do something bad, when they do something annoying, when they do something hurtful, our brain, being a cognitive miser, our brain explains their behavior as being within their control. It says something about who they are, their disposition, their character, and it's just like the way they are. It is a stable thing. This cartoon from Peanuts, Charlie Brown, he says, "Why are you always so quick to criticize me?" She says, "I just think I have a knack for seeing other people's faults." He says, "What about your own faults?" And she says, "I have a knack for overlooking them." This is true of all of us. We are quick to criticize and judge others, but when we do the exact same kind of thing, We give ourselves the benefit of the doubt. We're nicer to ourselves. We don't judge ourselves because we know that we have a good reason for doing whatever it is that we do. Okay. So take a look at this check for understanding here. Imagine a scenario where Jada comes into class late, and Noah mutters under his breath, "That girl is always late." Who is the actor? Who is the observer? What type of attribution is being made? And is Noah's claim, does that mean that he's more likely to be from a Western culture or an Eastern culture? So you should be able to kind of analyze this action using the different aspects of attribution that we have discussed. Okay, cool. So let's talk about some unique ways that we explain people's behavior, something called the self-serving bias. We may have talked about this way back in our unit on cognition, but self-serving bias, you serve yourself, you make yourself look good. You take credit for good things, but if a bad thing happens, you blame other people. If we win the match, you say, "We won." If the team loses, we say, "Oh, the team lost," right? The stupid Falcons, Braves, Bulldogs, insert your favorite Georgia team here. Self-serving bias, we try to make ourselves look good. Something else that our brains do, we often think that everybody agrees with us about things. It's a false belief that everyone believes. Everybody hates Tom Brady. Everybody loves barbecue chicken pizza. Everyone enjoys Taylor Swift's music. If I think that everyone agrees with me, it's called the false consensus bias. Another thing that we do, confirmation bias. When something happens, when we've made up our mind about something, we try to find information that agrees with and supports and confirms what we already think. If someone provides information that goes against us, we just ignore that information. This is why people who are a little bit conservative and Republican, they like to watch Fox News because they kind of have their mind made up. They're leaning one way already. And then what they hear and see in the news, it confirms the way that they think, right? They might just like completely ignore things on CNN. Folks who are more Democrat, more liberal, they might prefer watching CNN because they had their minds made up about how things are, and they don't want to see contradictory information from Fox News. They look for information, a network, a news anchor, who's going to kind of make them feel smart, make them feel like they know what's going on. Okay? These are all ways that our brain tries to explain things. Other things. In class, we talked about a scenario where I asked, I'll try and explain who was at fault for this terrible thing that occurred, right? We often make what's called defensive attributions. It's kind of like a defense mechanism. You think back about Freud, where when bad things happen, we try and find someone to blame. The idea that terrible things just kind of happen randomly to people, the idea that bad things can happen to good people, we don't like that because our brain's like, that means that bad things could happen to us. Terrible things could happen to me just randomly. We don't like that. It makes us feel insecure. So instead, we try to come up with explanations. Sometimes this results in what's called victim blaming, right? Where you try and find like a scapegoat, someone to blame. This might often happen when you don't have a lot in common with the victim, right? You might blame the victim, or in other cases, you might blame someone who's really not at fault because we identify with the victim. But the idea is that your brain is always trying to come up with an explanation for why things happen. And we call this the just world hypothesis, that the world is just and fair. Our brains want to believe that people get what they deserve. Good things will happen to good people and bad things will happen to bad people. That's typically not always how the world works, but our brain really wants to believe it. And that's why your brain jumps to conclusions and tries to explain things. Why do good things happen? Why do bad things happen? Your brain is trying to protect itself. So here's an example. Watch your brain at work here. On a scale of 1 to 10, who is at fault for the murder, the woman or the man? I'm going to give you a series of headlines. Imagine the headline says, "Woman murdered by convicted felon." So on a scale of 1 to 10, how at fault is the woman and how at fault is the convicted felon, right? Well, most folks at this point will say like, oh, the woman on a scale of 1 to 10 seems to be like at a 1, and the convicted felon seems to be like a 10 in terms of fault for the murder. But what if the headline says, "Woman murdered by convicted felon at 3 a.m. after a night of drinking"? Woman murdered by convicted felon with whom she was having an affair at 3 a.m. after a night of drinking. Woman murdered by convicted felon with whom she was having an affair at 3 a.m. after a night of drinking in drug deal gone wrong. Okay. What happens to your brain is I say now, who's at fault for the murder? Is it the woman? Or is it the convicted felon? Right? What's going to happen in your brain is you're going to change who you are blaming because your brain takes in information and constantly tries to adjust things so that the world makes sense. Good things happen to good people, but bad things happen to bad people. And therefore, if a bad thing happened to someone, there must have been somebody bad involved. Okay. It's interesting how your brain changes who it blames. 2 sections left. Something else your brain can do when it's thinking about other people, it's called a self-fulfilling prophecy. Sometimes it's called the behavioral confirmation effect. But here's the idea. Somebody has a belief, they have a thought, and that belief makes them act a certain way. And because they acted a certain way, that thing that actually might not have been true originally, it becomes true. That's kind of confusing. Let me give you an example. If you think that Katie hates you, and like she actually doesn't, right? But if you think she hates you, you have a belief, right? You're the prophet here. You have a belief, you act a certain way, you are rude to Katie, and guess what ends up happening? It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. She does end up hating you because of your actions. Another example. Johnny thinks he is a poor student, so he doesn't even bother studying, and he ends up becoming a poor student. Johnny is now the prophet. He had a belief. Therefore, he acted a certain way, and then that belief came true. This is a self-fulfilling prophecy. You think something, makes you act a certain way, and then that thing becomes true, even though it initially wasn't the case. Self-fulfilling prophecies. These can be good and these can be bad. Okay. When these things are good, we call it the Pygmalion effect. Everyone say it. Pygmalion. That's a fun word. Pygmalion. It's from a famous play. If any of you have seen the musical My Fair Lady, the idea here is that they take a commoner, a peasant, a poor, uncivilized member of the lower class, and they turn this person into sort of upper class, aristocratic individual. By changing their behaviors and changing the expectations that people have for them, it actually makes the person change. So the researchers who did this work are called Rosenthal and Jacobson. And what they did in particular was they looked at how in schools, the way teachers feel about their students, it impacts how those students perform. Okay, it's the expectations of the observer. So sometimes called the observer expectancy effect. And here's the takeaway that you want to write down and star. People perform better when people have high expectations for them, right? If your boss says, I expect great things from you, and they support you accordingly, it's going to improve your performance over time. On the flip side, if people have low expectations for you, if they think you're no good, you're dumb, you're lazy, you're going to be a failure, well, they might treat you a certain way that ends up with you performing poorly, being a failure, doing a bad job, struggling because of the low expectations they're on you. We call this the Gollum effect. So the Pygmalion effect is good, right? High expectations help you out. The Gollum effect is bad. It's when low expectations hurt you. So in school, the Pygmalion effect would be, teacher thinks the student is smart, and therefore teacher gives more time and attention and support for students. Student actually learns more over time, and they actually do get better grades. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. It works with schools, it works in relationships too, right? So here we have the guy likes the girl, brings her flowers, makes her feel good about herself, and she ends up being even more attractive to other people. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Feeling a certain way about somebody might make them actually live into that expectation and ideal. All right. So see if you can answer these questions on your own. Quick little check for understanding for you. Appreciate you all. Have a great day. Peace out.